Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the honor of serving as the Jonathan Fanton Director of Roosevelt House. And on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the President of Hunter College, it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to an event that is sure to pull back the proverbial curtain that still veils the operations of the White House from the public. Shed light on how the Oval Office, its occupants, and its emissaries, especially its chiefs of staff, managed to carry the ball on legislation, or as we've seen recently, failed to carry the ball on legislation. It's a particular privilege to debut this book in the House that Franklin Roosevelt used as his post-election headquarters from November 1932 through March 1933, to construct not only the policies that evolved into the New Deal once he reached Washington, but to assemble the staff that would carry his aspirations into practice, that would shepherd proposals into legislation. So FDR, as you'll see when you go upstairs and buy the book and read it, never named a formal chief of staff for himself. But whether it was a combination of Missy LeHand and Harold Ickes and Steve Early, it's fascinating how much his drivers of policy and administration got done, even as FDR kept them off balance about who was really in charge. The focus tonight, of course, is on actual White House chiefs of staff, and our special guest tonight has interviewed all 17 living chiefs of staff. From James Baker to Rahm Emanuel, with names like Don Rumsfeld, Leon Panetta, and Andy Card in between. Chris Whipple not only turns an unrelenting spotlight on their successes and failures, their power and their frustrations, he brings a sort of a backhoe to the history to excavate the evolving tradition of the constantly shifting expectations of White House chiefs of staff with the public, among the sprawling workforce in the West Wing and the EOB, and of course with their bosses, the men who often delegate to them the power of the world's most powerful job to get things moving in Washington. There is no question that the choices that Chris has made are comprehensive. The access he's earned is astonishing. The revelations he's amassed are just revelatory. And although this White House is not yet known for examining, much less absorbing, the lessons of history, though we can say that this is the first White House staff that is functioning with the help of Frederick Douglass in a very long time. The era, the working methods, the access, and the political power of the current chiefs of staff demands that we line up at what Chris Whipple has called the gate of history and check the gatekeepers, the unelected powerhouses who have done so much to advance policy over the years. So we're thrilled to welcome Chris Whipple. He's a widely honored journalist and filmmaker who has won Emmy Awards, Christopher Awards, Peabody Awards, and a Columbia DuPont Golden Baton Award for his work, the last of those honors for outstanding coverage for ABC News of the 9/11 attacks. His acclaimed Showtime documentary, The Spy Masters, gave Americans more access to the intelligence community than any single source until Chairman Nunes visited the White House grounds. You're hearing my debut jokes, too. As Tom Brokaw has said in a more serious vein, Chris Whipple takes us deep inside one of the most important and demanding jobs in Washington. Here we get to know how great power is managed and exercised by those who have held the job. If you're a political junkie or merely curious, this is the book for you. And speaking of being a political junkie, which many of us admit to, it is a great honor to welcome to Roosevelt House a man who has fed our habit for decades, honorably, reliably, and incisively. From 1982 to 2004, he was the anchor and managing editor of NBC Nightly News, but his career goes back many years before the anchor era, so he has been with NBC for more than 50 years. He has served over the last decade as a special correspondent, during which time he moderated one of the presidential debates between Barack Obama and John McCain. In each role, he has made news not only the first draft of history, but used it to look back and analyze history himself. And of course, he is a historian in his own right. His great book, The Greatest Generation, was one of the finest stories of World War II ever written. He exemplifies the greatest generation in TV journalism as well, and we're honored to have him. So before I turn the proceedings over to him, just one word of housekeeping. We hope to have a conversation of about 50 minutes to be followed by Q&A from the audience, after which you're all more than invited. You're summoned upstairs to a reception in honor of Chris Whipple, at which you will be able to buy the book for the first day and get it signed. The only admonition I have is please check your cell phones. Someone has a cell phone on, I know it, I can feel it. And we are live streaming this for our Hunter students who are busy studying, and we're also going to keep it on our website for us to view and review. And now with the preliminaries finally done, it's a pleasure to turn the proceedings over to Tom Brokaw and Chris Whipple.
I just want to make something very clear. In the course of his introduction, Mr. Holzer has written 2 more books on Abraham Lincoln, just while he was standing there. That's the only way he can get these things done. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to draw attention to Chris Whipple's book, because I have felt from the moment that I began to cover presidential politics, it was the least understood and most powerful job, not just in Washington, but in many ways in the world, White House Chief of Staff. And Chris has done an amazing job of providing the kind of insight that I think not just political junkies, but citizens everywhere need to read and understand to see how government should work, or in some cases how it doesn't work and why it doesn't work. So, Chris, let's begin with the film that you made, first of all, about Chiefs of Staff, and how that led you to this book.
Yeah. Well, you know, it all began with a phone call out of the blue from a great filmmaker who was sitting in the second row here, Jules Naudet. He and Gideon Naudet had done 9/11, which was the iconic documentary on that day. And they had this crazy idea to sit down with every living White House Chief of Staff and do a documentary, which we did. It aired in 2013. But, you know, it really, even though it was 4 hours, it barely scratched the surface, I thought, of an amazing untold story about 17 living chiefs as of now who, you know, are not only the president's closest confidants, but the people the president depend on to execute their agendas. An untold story, really, and as you say, a little understood job. Fascinating characters, some of them household names like Dick Cheney, others like Jack Watson, who were brilliant and should have been chief of staff on day one for Jimmy Carter, but wasn't, alas. It just struck me as stunning that no one had ever done this book before. And so I spent the last 5 years since that phone call from Jules going back for more interviews with the chiefs. I was lucky to be able to talk to, you were one of the great interviews in the book, and I can't think of a more glorious way to launch the book than having you turn the tables and interview me. So that's how it began.
Flattery will get you everywhere. I just want you to know that here at the beginning. Well, I was very taken with the book for the obvious reasons. I'm a political correspondent, and I started covering chiefs of staff really during the Nixon administration when Bob Haldeman had that job and knew him well. And I've always felt that it was the least understood, least appreciated, and most powerful job, not just in White House or on Pennsylvania Avenue, but in the world. It is one of the most powerful jobs because they help direct presidential policy and they help shape the presidential character of them all. What were the common traits that made a successful chief of staff for the White House?
Well, as you well know, Jim Baker would be on everybody's short list of who's the best White House Chief of Staff. Leon Panetta might be a close second. I think, character and temperament have a lot to do with it. You think about these guys. Jim Baker was a 50-year-old Texas lawyer. You know him well. A smooth operator with great judgment. He knew Capitol Hill. He knew how to put deals together. He knew how to reach across the aisle. He knew how to manage Ronald Reagan. He knew how to manipulate Ed Meese, his rival for influence. A great story I love about Baker is that Ronald Reagan, the smart money was on Meese. Everybody thought Ed Meese, who had been Reagan's White House Chief of Staff, would become who had been his Chief of Staff as governor, would become White House Chief of Staff. To his credit, Reagan realized, with help from Nancy and Stu Spencer, the great Republican campaign manager, that Baker would be the better choice. So Reagan said to Baker, "Make it right with Ed." The next morning, Baker had breakfast with Ed Meese, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and started divvying up their job responsibilities. Ed Meese got a lot of fancy titles, and Jim Baker got everything that mattered. Gatekeeper to the president. He controlled the paper flow and information to the president. He was in charge of executing Ronald Reagan's agenda. Long-winded way of answering your question, but I think he was a savvy operator. He knew how to execute Reagan's agenda, which we can talk about. But I think that's something the good ones have in common.
And
don't you?
And those who failed, why did they fail?
A lot of reasons, and there have been plenty of not very successful chiefs. One, Don Regan, famously, Nancy Reagan said this was arguably the most disastrous job swap in political history. When Jim Baker...
It wasn't not for Baker, it wasn't the most disastrous.
No, for the country and for the White House. When James Baker left after 4 years, exhausted, worn out, desperate to get out of that job, he swapped jobs with the Treasury Secretary, Donald Regan. Regan was a former co-chairman of Merrill Lynch. He was an arrogant,
tough Irish Marine.
He and Reagan were great drinking buddies. But he was a terrible choice as Chief of Staff, and one of the reasons, and it's become one of Jim Baker's, we've all heard of Rumsfeld's rules, one of Baker's rules is that if you've been a principal, if you've been a CEO, if you've been a governor, if you've been in charge of ordering people around, you're probably not going to be a very good Chief of Staff. The most important word in the title is staff, not chief. Regan got that exactly backwards. He loved the word chief. So I think that's something that the unsuccessful ones had in common.
And going back within the same time frame, Dick Cheney, who's a different Dick Cheney now than he was when he was Chief of Staff. I was covering the White House at that time. I'd been at it for a while, and Cheney and I had kind of common background. We both grew up in the West. We both stumbled coming out of high school, and then we recovered, and we continue to have this interest in politics. But any White House correspondent during that time had high praise for Cheney. He was available. He did a good job of managing Gerald Ford on the campaign trail as well as in the White House.
Well, you know him well, and you've known him well for a long time. Cheney is a terrific sort of untold story, because people who knew him as you did when he was Jerry Ford's 34-year-old White House Chief of Staff, Dick Cheney was the life of the party. He was the most popular guy in Washington. The press corps loved him. He had a wry sense of humor, and he was the guy you wanted, a guy with no ego, the guy you wanted in the room when you had to arrive at some sort of consensus. He was a great conciliator, like Howard Baker. And so it's become almost a parlor game among the chiefs. What the hell happened to Cheney? What in the world happened to Cheney? Where did that guy go? And there are a lot of different theories. Brent Scowcroft's theory, and he was Cheney's closest friend until the Iraq War. As you well know, Scowcroft's theory is that it was his heart. It was his heart condition that changed it. It was a bad heart. Cheney says that's nonsense, and Cheney says, well, I didn't change, the world changed. You know, it was 9/11.
You want to hear my theory?
I want to hear your theory.
I don't think it was the heart. I think it was the petroleum club in Houston when he left politics and went into the petroleum industry.
Really?
And he was in a different culture, and he was having lunch every day with very smart oil barons, and they had a narrow view of the world. And I saw the change in him. I saw it from the time he left Washington, when he got back, and I talked to him when he was in Houston about various things, and I could detect the change that was going on at that point. That was my theory about it. Everybody who's ever dealt with him has been flummoxed by the changes in who he was.
Two very quick stories about Cheney. And one of the real research breakthroughs that we made, I say we because my wife, Carrie, was helping me when I left ABC News and I was on my own and I had no Rolodex and I had to track these guys down, and we were trying to find Cheney's home address so we could send him a letter. And Carrie found it on a website called warcriminals.com. That was our first research breakthrough, and the rest was easy. And actually, Cheney loves that story. Yeah, by the way, Cheney loves being called Darth Vader. As you well know, it's a badge of honor for him.
I have one divergence about Cheney that is worth sharing, at least for the humor part of it. Dick Cheney famously went from Casper, Wyoming, where he was a homecoming king, and Lynn, his wife, was homecoming queen. He was a football player, and Casper, a lawyer, was a Yale graduate, and he said, you should go to Yale. And so Cheney did. And by the end of his freshman year, one of his classmates, somebody I knew well, said he never saw him draw a sober breath the whole time he was there. So he crawled back to Wyoming, and his family gathered around, and the lawyer said, look, we can get you back in. You're not going to get the same financial help that you'd had before. So Cheney goes back, repeats the same pattern of behavior, and is thrown out again. And then the family and other people in Wyoming said, look, you can do this. We'll raise the money to finance your education. He blew out of Yale a third time, 3 times, and went back to Wyoming, went to work in the oil patch, continued heavy drinking, and on the night that his high school class was graduating from colleges in the Great West and his class at Yale was graduating, he was in a drunk tank in Wyoming.
He woke up on the floor.
Woke up on the floor and knew that he had to change, and that he crawled out of there and said, I'm going to have to finance it for myself, and that was the turnaround moment. Now, having said that, when he is part of the inauguration as the new Vice President of the United States, I was on the air on NBC, and I said, quite casually, I thought that Dick Cheney, well known in this community, he was a very successful White House Chief of Staff, then he went to Congress where he was highly regarded, rose quickly in the leadership. What is not known about him very much is that he flunked out of Yale 3 times but managed to recover and go on. So the next day I'm at the White House for the beginning of the administration. Cheney, Brokaw, come here a minute. I go over and he said, biggest moment of my life. I go home to watch the taping of the inauguration of this new administration. I have my children and grandchildren around me. And I hear Tom Brokaw talking about my 3 flunking out at Yale. How could you have done that? I said, God. So I went back and I re-recorded it. And I said, for his purposes only, there's Dick Cheney from Wyoming, very successful congressman. And then he was White House, and he was also White House Chief of Staff. He gave Yale 3 opportunities to educate him. And when it didn't work out, he managed to reinvent himself. And I said, for your eyes only, Cheney. So let's go back beyond Don Regan, for example. Here's somebody else who was a successful Chief of Staff, in my judgment, until he fell way, way off the tracks. And that was Bob Haldeman when he got there, and how he organized the White House and the record keeping that was done and the linear line of responsibility.
So all of Haldeman's successors will tell you that he really wrote he created the template for the modern White House chief of staff. Nobody did it better. Cheney says, they were all together in 1986 at a conference in San Diego, and Haldeman showed up long after he'd done his jail time for Watergate, and he wowed them, all of these guys who thought they knew how to run the White House. So Haldeman he ran a tight ship, and one of the real mysteries about him is how did he permit Watergate to happen? Because he was, as Evan Thomas, his biographer, told me, and as you know, he really ran an efficient operation. And the only real answer to that, I guess, is that he couldn't speak truth to power. He couldn't tell the president what he didn't want to hear. And of course, the other problem in Nixon's case, and we'll see if there's a parallel with our current president. The other problem, of course, is that Nixon was guilty from day one. He was the cover-up began on day one, and Nixon was intimately, deeply involved in the cover-up. And at that point, what do you do? How do you manage that as a White House chief? I don't know. But in the end, he went to jail. Nixon famously resigned, and the irony of all that, as you know, is that this guy who was the poster boy for Watergate, Haldeman, is admired by all his successors for how he set up the operation.
One of my impressions is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it is very important for a White House chief of staff to understand all the DNA of Washington, not just at that job, but on the Hill and in the agencies and the lobbyists and all the other parts of it. And I don't think anyone had a more failing understanding of that than Hamilton Jordan when he came with Jimmy Carter.
Yeah. Somebody described it as almost like Andrew Jackson and shoeless rubes coming into the White House. It was, Jimmy Carter was famously an outsider president. Carter and also was quite possibly the most intelligent president elected in the 20th century. Ronald Reagan famously and unfairly was called an amiable dunce, you remember, by Clark Clifford. And yet Reagan understood something, intuited something that Carter did not, which is that he needed an insider. He needed a Jim Baker to make things happen. Carter didn't understand that. Carter, for all his brilliance, thought he could run the White House himself. He was chastened by the example of Watergate and Haldeman and just thought it was a terrible idea to have an empowered chief. So Ham Jordan, when Carter came in, Ham Jordan was far and away the closest advisor to Jimmy Carter, but there's a wonderful character in the book whom not many people may know named Jack Watson, who was, Jack was a brilliant guy, a charmer, a smooth, grounded.
Hollywood handsome.
Yeah, he had matinee idol looks. He could charm the birds out of the trees. He would go and meet with the Clark Cliffords of Washington, and they'd all say, "Wow, if Jimmy Carter's like him, well, let's get to work." He should have been Carter's first chief of staff. There was a revolt by Ham Jordan and Jody Powell and the real campaign insiders against Watson. Watson lost out. Ham Jordan became White House chief of staff de facto because Carter didn't want to give him the title, but he was the de facto chief, and he was the worst possible guy in that role. He had nothing but contempt for the establishment and for Capitol Hill. Famously, never returned phone calls, and then Tip O'Neill took to calling him Hannibal Jerkin. So ultimately, to finish this story, but ultimately, Carter realized he needed an effective chief of staff, and it really wasn't until the last year of Carter's presidency, as you know, that Carter finally made Jack Watson White House chief, and by all accounts, Watson ran a very smooth, efficient White House, started returning calls from Capitol Hill, but it was too late for Carter. The hostage crisis, the OPEC,
20% interest rates.
20% interest rates. So there was nothing. But it's a fascinating question to me. What if Jack Watson had been chief of staff from day one? all of Carter's senior people, Stu Eisenstadt and others will tell you, it might have been a different story. Might have been a much smoother operation.
So Bill Clinton, with a keen awareness of how Washington works, arrives from Little Rock, and he brings a boyhood friend and makes him the chief of staff.
Mac McLarty was Bill Clinton's chief of staff on day one. Clinton gave almost no thought to his White House staff and lots of thought to his cabinet. Clinton just didn't understand that the White House staff was more important. At the very last minute, he picks McLarty to become his chief of staff. Mac, as you know, is one of the most wonderful guys on the planet. No enemies, very smart, very capable. But Clinton was so undisciplined and so, McLarty didn't have the authority, wasn't empowered to run that White House the way it had to be run. I mean, famously, somebody who said we went from war room, there was the famous war room during the campaign, to dorm room. There were, 30 people in every Oval Office meeting, and 20 of them shouldn't have been there. And it was completely out of control. And it's not Mac's fault, but really Clinton's fault. And it wasn't until a year and a half in, when Clinton was, I think, dead in the water, with all Travelgate and Whitewater and all of these other problems, that Leon Panetta was tapped to replace Mac McLarty. And Panetta, who Robert Reich described him to me as a guy with an iron fist and a velvet glove. Leon was smooth as silk and a gregarious guy, and everybody loved him, but he was a tough customer.
And he knew the Hill.
He knew the Hill. And with Erskine Bowles' help, Erskine was, a very efficient multimillionaire businessman. With Erskine's help, they just turned that White House right around. Don't you think? Wasn't that?
Oh,
yours?
I do. I absolutely do.
Yeah.
And it came just in time, by the way.
Yeah. I think he would have been a one-term president. I think Clinton would have been a one-term president if not for Leon Panetta. That's how critical the chief's job can be.
I like Mac McLarty, and he was successful after he left there, and he'd been successful before he arrived. But my experience with him was in the White House. He was too much in awe of the setting and of the job that he had a hard time adjusting to where he was. And I remember one lunch that we had a month after they arrived, and they were getting ready for the State of the Union address, and they were getting briefed on it. And Mac was like a schoolboy in a cathedral. Even a month later, he was just kind of in awe and sharing his sense of history with the rest of us about where he was. And what we wanted was somebody get down and get to the nails. No chief of staff had a tougher job, it seems to me, at a given moment than when George Bush 43 was reading to school children in Florida.
Andy Card, famously in that iconic piece of video, walks in and informs Bush 43 that we're under attack. And shortly thereafter, after they raced to Air Force One and took off for destination unknown, Bush was adamant. He was yelling at Card and ordering Card, saying, "I'm the President of the United States. Change course. We're going to Washington, D.C." That's an order. And he was red-faced, screaming at Card. And Card had to do what lots of chiefs of staff have to do from time to time, which is say, "Sorry, Mr. President, but no, we're not going to do that." So that was a case of speaking truth to power, which Andy Card did successfully. I think, but Andy Card had almost mission impossible with Bush 43, I think, because I've mentioned before that every president needs to empower a White House chief to be in charge. And Bush 43 didn't want that. I don't think he wanted a chief of staff in the mold of Jim Baker. I think he gave Vice President Cheney tremendous authority and influence and power, especially over national security. And then, as you know, there became this internecine battle between Secretary Powell, Colin Powell, on the one hand, Cheney and Rumsfeld, it was really something that Andy Card was unable to control. And one of my favorite stories in the book, which I don't think has been reported anywhere else, was Jim Baker told me, and Stu Spencer confirmed, and Scowcroft. Bush 41, George's father, was so troubled by the walk up to the Iraq War, was so disturbed by the impending war that Jim Baker actually went to Colin Powell with 41's blessing and said, "You need to fall on your sword here. You need to tell the president this is not what you signed up for." Colin Powell wouldn't do it. Anyway, I think that I'm going to be on Morning Joe with Andy tomorrow morning. We'll see how he feels about the book. But I think he's a capable guy who is in over his head. What do you think?
You know, I do think that he was capable on the day-to-day stuff. I think
Yeah.
the equation changed for him with 9/11, obviously. I mean, it became, and then he was dealing with two of the greatest power manipulators in Washington, Cheney and Rumsfeld. They had their own agenda at that point, and they were willing to blow by him, and they had somebody in there.
Colin Powell has a slightly different version, by the way, on what happened when they came to see him.
He told me that different version over the phone.
Yeah, you know, I got caught in the middle of that, knowing both of them, and
It still touches his fuse pretty quickly.
It surely does.
he's very sensitive about his role at that time and what was going on.
He told me when I told him that story, I got him on the phone and I said, General Powell, let me cut right to the chase. Jim Baker tells me that he came to you, and this was in the prior to the Iraq invasion, and told you, and I gave him the story, and he said, Jim really say that? And I said, well, he did. He said, well, if Jim said it, I'm not going to deny it. I'm not going to deny it. And then he said, a few minutes later, he said, but God damn it, I am sick of this blank. And you really had to peel him off the ceiling.
You know, I think that everybody admires Colin Powell for all the right reasons, but I think that moment and those decisions, he'll carry with him forever, frankly.
He says, he told me, he said, look, I'm asked about it every day.
Yeah.
I'm asked about the UN speech every day.
Yeah. And
It's a cross that he will always bear. But I think that Andy, this was a case where Powell believes, and I find it persuasive, Powell believes that Cheney had such outsized influence and power in that administration that it prevented Card from playing the role of honest broker. That it was, that's, all the other hats the chief wears, the most important function, maybe, is to be the guy who is the honest broker of information to the president. And I don't think he was able to do it in those circumstances.
Let's use Baker for a moment as the model. He is, by the judgments of all the other chiefs, whatever their party, the gold standard, the guy who knew how to, he set the modern tone for it. I've been spending some time looking at why he was able to do that, especially in the context of the chaos in Washington right now. And it seems to me that there were some very obvious points in his favor. First of all, he came to Washington as a mature man. He was 45 years old before he got there. He'd been a very successful lawyer in Houston doing M&As and real estate and oil. So, I mean, he had been...
he was 50 when he became chief.
Yeah, he'd been in the cauldron. Well, I think he was 45 when he got to the Commerce Department.
Okay.
And then, he very quickly was discovered there. So he came as a mature person, and he came from most of you probably know this, he came from a distinguished Texas background, but they didn't overplay their role. They were people of wealth, and they'd been successful, but they had a sense of proportion about their success. And his father, I think I'll get this right, the 5 Ps were prior preparation leads to success, or I can't remember what the whole thing was. And the other thing about Baker, which remains to this day, he said, in any negotiation, you begin by trying to see it through the eyes of the people you're negotiating with. That's highly unusual in Washington these days, for you to walk into a room I don't think the current president sees the negotiations through the eyes of other people. So he had a kind of standard when he arrived, and it was based on his experience, Texas-born, Princeton-educated, Marine, could not go into his father's law firm when he got back to Houston because there was a nepotism rule, and his father was still alive, so imagine that. So he went to another firm and became Jim Baker. So when he arrived in Washington, he had this wealth of experience, and it's that kind of person, I think, that what you're looking for, that you can see it not just from the Oval out, but from outside the Oval in.
He was able to tell Reagan what Reagan didn't want to hear. And to make an analogy with what's going on right now, Reagan was hell-bent in the very beginning of his administration to go to Capitol Hill and reform Social Security. That's what he wanted to do. Baker, knowing the Hill and knowing his way around, realized that that was the third rail of American politics. You touch it, you get electrocuted, as he put it. And he persuaded Reagan to change course and go with tax reform. Well, the rest is history. When Trump decided, or Bannon, or whoever it was, decided that it would be a great idea to reform and repeal Obamacare first, I would say that Obamacare might be the modern equivalent of Social Security. You touch it, you get electrocuted. And that bill was, the incoherence of that bill, and the fact that had it been coherent and had they been able to pass it, it would have come back to bite them in the end because so many of their constituents were going to lose their coverage. That was a case where Priebus, if he were an effective chief of staff, would have said to Trump, "No, you do not want to go down that road, don't you think?"
Well, I think Priebus's problem was that he was so close to the speaker, both from Wisconsin, and the speaker thought he had cobbled something together that would work. As a reporter, just on the outside looking in, and I've been very, very interested in my entire career on how healthcare was formulated. The obvious observation was they spent 8 years trying to repeal it, and then when they got there, they put together the substitute overnight. I mean, they had not been working on it during that entire time. And that was an extraordinary failure on the part of...
but can you imagine Jim Baker or Leon Panetta would have said, "No, Mr. President, listen, this is not going to fly, and you do not want to jeopardize all of your momentum by hitting a brick wall on the very first major initiative. You can't go down this road." I think that's what Jim Baker would have said.
Before we go to questions, let me just ask you about what you found out about the White House Chief of Staff who became putatively the President of the United States, and that was Al Haig.
There's a great story. One of my favorite stories in the book is concerns the day Reagan was shot, and a very close aide to Jim Baker, who will remain nameless, was standing in her office when this manic character in a trench coat came racing in and yelling at the top of his lungs, "The president's been shot in the back! The president's been shot in the back! Get me through to Air Force 2, where Bush, where the Vice President Bush 41 was," and this aide couldn't believe what she was saying, and like a madman, he then retreated and disappeared, only to show up, of course, on national television, mangling the order of presidential succession, as you all know, a little bit later. That's my Al Haig story from the book.
Well, the Al Haig stories that I have come from the Nixon administration when he had that corner office. And when Nixon was upstairs brooding, talking to the walls and drinking heavily, Al Haig was effectively the President of the United States during that time. I mean, he was making all the decisions. And he struck the deal with Gerald Ford on the way out that led to the pardon. I think that Ford might have come to that conclusion on his own, even without Haig's influence, but he did have that. So by the time he got to this administration, he had a very empowered sense of who he was and what he could get done.
Yeah. One of the stories I liked it comes from my buddy, David Kennerly, who was Ford's White House photographer and whom Jules and I met when we first did the documentary together. He worked with us. Kennerly was this colorful character who was very close, like a son to Ford. Nobody could manage him. Cheney used to say to his secretary, "Get me Dick Kennerly, get me David Kennerly," and an hour would go by, and she'd come back and say, "I'm sorry, Mr. Cheney, he's having cocktails with the president." Anyway, it was during one of those cocktail hours with Jerry Ford and the residents that Ford, having decided to bring in Don Rumsfeld as the iron fist to turn his White House around, was trying to figure out what in the world to do with Haig. And Kennerly suddenly said, "What about Supreme Commander of NATO?" And over cocktails, Ford said, "Yeah, that'll get him out of town." That's Kennerly's story, and he's sticking to it.
Kennerly is a wonderful imp and a very smart and more influential as a figure in history than people realize. There were a number of those. Well, at any rate, this is a fascinating book for junkies, but we're here as well to hear your questions. So I think we have microphones, right? There's one right at the back of the room. First hand up.
Thank you for such an enlightening presentation. You made a brief mention to the other partner in power, the person possibly in some administrations closest to the president, the spouse, up until now always been the wife. There's never been a woman chief of staff. And do you think one of the reasons is the dynamic between the chief of staff and the president's spouse? And under Obama, some people thought we'd see that, but we have yet to have a day where there is a woman sitting in that seat.
Yeah, it'll happen eventually. There was it almost happened in the Obama administration. Nancy Ann DeParle was a contender, I think. She was very close to Obama, and Obama, unlike a lot of other presidents, I think worked well with women, was unthreatened by, didn't have a problem with strong women. But DeParle, Nancy Ann DeParle, as smart as she was the sort of the brains behind Obamacare, didn't have any political experience. So she didn't really know the Hill. She didn't have that political touch. So that opportunity went by. Robert Reich told me when I asked him about this, he just said, "Look, I think there have been very few female campaign managers too, if you think about it. Maybe one that I can remember. So that'll change, but probably not very soon."
By the way, on that count, the most successful of those chiefs of staff that we've been talking about, almost all of them had very strong women around them in the offices. Yeah. There's a woman by the name of Margaret Tutwiler, who was Jim Baker's right hand. She had great antenna about what was going on. She could pick up stuff from the White House press corps that he wouldn't have heard necessarily, and gave him very, very good advice. A keen observer of the political climate at the time. Other questions?
Very excited to read the book. I don't know how long it took you in the preparation, but were you able to glean their opinion about the so-called administration now? That's one question. And the second question is, did any of them feel, guilty is a silly word, but did they feel any apprehension about revealing things that perhaps were not known before?
They were cautious at times, as you can, to answer the second question first. But by the end of my reporting, I was kind of pleasantly surprised and pleased at how open some of them were. I mean, the last interview I did with Dennis McDonough on the patio outside his office at the White House, he was extraordinarily candid, I thought. Leon Panetta, Clinton's chief, had been really scathing in his criticism of McDonough and had felt, for example, that McDonough should have insisted that Obama enforce the red line in Syria, for example, that kind of thing. Well, McDonough just gave it right back at Panetta. And so that chapter, I think that is fascinating to watch those guys play off each other. First question again, I'm sorry, was? Yeah, I finished the book, and I really finished the book right before the election. I wrote a hasty epilogue in December about what I thought would have to happen for Trump to be able to govern. The short answer is it has not happened. But, you know, unbelievably, my wife and I spent Election Day on a Bahamian island with Andy Card and Jack Watson, Jimmy Carter's last chief, and we watched the election returns together with their wives, and we all had our jaws on the floor, including Andy Card, so I don't think any of them saw it coming. One fascinating thing, there was December 16, 2016, 10 former White House chiefs were invited to the White House by Dennis McDonough to give Reince Priebus a chat. Priebus dutifully took notes, asked some good questions, but the chiefs who came away from that meeting did not come away with any confidence that this guy or anybody could be an effective chief of staff for Donald Trump.
At one of those earlier meetings of that crowd before George Bush, before Obama came into office, they had a meeting like that, which they all gathered. And Cheney sat Buddha-like until they called on him, and he said simply, "Keep your eye on your vice president," and it broke up the room at that.
Everybody cracked up.
Bill, right here on the aisle.
Yes. When all of these discussions, how did the chiefs relate to the presidents? Did they have lots of complaints? Did they continue to have good relationships with their president? Did they sort of open up about how awful he was? How? Give us a feel for that.
You know, that relationship is critical, as you can imagine, and I think most of them would tell you that you can't be the president's best friend. You can be a peer, but you can't be his best friend. It's a complicated relationship. You have to be empowered by the president. The moment, as Erskine Bowles put it, the moment anybody suspects that you're not speaking for the president, people can smell it, they can sense it, and you're dead. You're a dead man walking. That happened to Bill Daley, who lost the confidence of the president. It's just a bad fit. So it's a critical relationship. Most of them talk admiringly about the presidents that they served. But they don't sugarcoat the challenges. Bowles, on the one hand, would tell you that Bill Clinton was, absolutely brilliant, and had 1,000 great ideas every day. And he would, every time he came out of his office with another great idea, Bowles would grab him, turn him around, and take him back into the Oval Office, and say, "We're going back into the Oval Office. I told you, you can only do 3 ideas." And that was his approach. So there were, he was famously hard to discipline, Bill Clinton. And I think, and just to give you one more example, Bowles was really hurt personally and deeply, I think, by the Lewinsky affair. He has difficulty talking about it to this day. There was a meeting where the subject came up, and he literally got sick to his stomach and bolted out of the meeting and never came back. So, you can't minimize the human toll that some of this stress can inflict.
How many presidents continued their relationships with their chiefs of staff after their presidency, if any?
I didn't really study very carefully those relationships in the post-presidency. I think a lot of them have had close relationships. Dennis McDonough told me that a lot of people say that McDonough was like a brother to Obama. They were very close. McDonough dismissed that and said, no, I'm just a staff guy. He did say to me, I really hope I can become his good friend after this is over. I'm going to see Dennis on Thursday. I'll ask him. We're going to be on Face the Nation together on Easter Sunday, along with Ken Duberstein. But maybe Tom can answer that better than I can.
Well, one of the things I thought about the staff during the Obama administration is that Bill Daley was brought in to be the chief of staff. Keep well.
Your mic is just.
Have I lost
okay?
my mic? Bill Daley comes from, as you know, from one of the legendary families in American politics in Chicago. His whole upbringing was old-fashioned, get the job done politics. And it didn't, he was up against the Obama team, and that was a tighter circle. And he was not happy, and it was not very successful there at that time. So, these things, feeling about it and where they want to get to. And so one of my other favorites, however, is during the Commerce Department. Can you hear me? He was in the Commerce Department during the administration, and he was there during the Lewinsky scandal. And they had the cabinet come in at one point, and the president proclaimed his innocence. And then the cabinet walked out, and a couple of them were asked to then repeat what had happened in the private meeting. And Daley stepped up and said, he's got the confidence of the president. And Daley called me the next day, and he said, did you notice anything unusual about me? And I said, well, I was a little surprised. He said, the picture. He said, my tongue and my cheek the entire time that I was talking out there. So, every little character twitch has an impact on those jobs. And I think the hardest part of all is that you have to contain your own ego. You're not the president of the United States. You have to constantly defer to them and make them see what you believe is the right thing to do through their eyes. And that's a very tricky component. The two chiefs of staff for Reagan, who were at the opposite ends of that spectrum, were Don Regan, obviously, and Jim Baker. Don Regan hung up the phone on Nancy Reagan. I mean, you talk about a suicidal kind of gesture. That was pretty much
Baker
it.
said it was not just a firing offense, it was a hanging offense. Sorry, go ahead.
Pardon me?
Sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to say one other thing about Don Regan. I'm not sure I ever made this point. This was the most disastrous job swap in U.S. history because almost immediately thereafter, when Don Regan became White House chief, hatching in the basement of the White House was this scheme to trade arms to Iran for hostages.
Iran-Contra.
The Iran-Contra affair never would have happened on Jim Baker's watch. But Don Regan, who famously said that if a sparrow landed on the White House lawn, I'll know about it, somehow didn't notice the Iran-Contra scandal being hatched in the basement by a bunch of Looney Tunes. I mean, it was... Anyway.
We have time for one more question. Oh, back over here.
The Don Regan story now just leads me to the question I have, which is you've talked about how the president has to well, the chief of staff has to manage the president, has to know the Hill, all these other things. What are the experiences you've seen, given all these different case studies, of managing or dealing with the presidential spouse, and how that's a factor in what your job turns out to be?
I think Ken Duberstein said at one point, everybody thinks that White House chief has a constituency of one. It's a constituency of 1.5. Every chief has to be very attentive to the First Lady, and some more than others. Nancy Reagan famously was the personnel director, as Stuart Spencer described her. Somehow her radar failed her when Don Regan came along. She should have seen that was going to be a problem. But White House chiefs have to be very sensitive to the First Lady's concerns. Bill Daley got in real hot water with Michelle Obama when it was discovered that when apparently the maintenance workers were cleaning up the outside of the White House, they discovered bullets embedded there, and it turned out that somebody had pulled out an AK-47 and fired at the White House. Well, Daley didn't inform the First Lady in a timely manner about this. It was a week later instead of immediately thereafter, and President Obama got an earful, and so did Daley. Michelle Obama was not pleased. This didn't help Bill Daley's cause or longevity as White House chief. But I'm sure you know many examples too, Tom, with Nancy and others. But
I think that, with the notable exception of this administration, that the spouses, and there will be male spouses who will be in that job, because we'll have a woman president before the century is out. Parenthetically, let me just also say, I think that this is going to be the century of women. I really think at the end of the 21st century, historians will look back and say the profound changes that we were witness to. The rise of women will be in the very top tier of all of that. But you'll have women who are, with the exception of this administration, who will be very active in what they're doing. And it began really with, it really did begin, Nancy set the pace for that in terms of her. She had an uncanny instinct about personnel, as you were saying. I'll just tell you one quick story about White House Chief of Staff and the relationships with the reporters that involved Nancy and how good she was. Shortly after they took office, I did an intemperate interview with Mother Jones of all publications, in which I said, and you got to remember, I started covering him in 1966 when he was running for governor of California, and we had a very correct relationship. It wasn't terribly deeply personal, but when they came here, they knew me from California, and I think that they had certain expectations. Anyhow, in this interview, I said something was not wrong, but they had just arrived, in which I said, I get a little worried about his poor boy background, because he did have a tough childhood, but very quickly after college, he got a very good job in Iowa Broadcasting, and then very quickly after that, he was a contract player at Universal in Hollywood. So I'm a little wary about this poor boy stuff that we keep reading about. Well, Nancy went ballistic, apparently, and thought that, and she let Jim Baker know and Mike Deaver know that she didn't want to have Brokaw within 100 miles of the White House. So Baker called me and he said, buddy, just stay away. You do not want to get involved in this. We'll let you know when it's safe to come back into the zone. And I said, I'm not apologizing. He said, no, we understand. So about 3 months later, I get a call from Deaver, and Deaver says, you're going to be invited to the state dinner for the president of Mexico. You're going to have to figure out what you're going to say to Nancy in the receiving line. Don't worry about the president. He doesn't even know about this. He could care less, I'm sure, but you figure it out about what you're going to say. And I said, okay, but I'm not apologizing. He said, no, we understand. So we go to the White House, and we're in the receiving line. We're getting ever a bit closer. And Meredith is that I said, you haven't decided? I said, I haven't decided. And she's getting more nervous than I am at that point. And we get right to her, and she just gives me that famous Nancy Reagan steely look. And I spontaneously threw my arms up and I said, Nancy, back to square one. And she looked at me for a moment, broke up laughing, threw up her arms and said, Tom, back to square one. White House photographer got that moment. That picture arrived the next day in my office, signed by Nancy Reagan saying, Dear Tom, back to square one, love Nancy. That's how good she was at what she did. I mean, she completely won that exchange. And how uncanny she was about how to do the right thing at the right time. And, we'd had differences along the way. I was a reporter, after all, covering him, and she'd let me know through third parties that she thought I was wrong, and I'd say, well, I've worked on this pretty hard. I think I know where I'm going with it. The last interview I had with the president was a Friday before he was leaving office, and it was the last interview he was going to be giving as a sitting president. And it was very carefully arranged. It was going to be 1.5 hour, and it would start at 11:30. It would end at noon, and we had a very careful set of instructions from the whole White House staff about you get this done and then move on. So the president comes in the Oval Office at 11:30, looking every inch Ronald Reagan. And by then, by the way, I thought that there was about 2 degrees off plumb, frankly, that he wasn't tracking as well as he might have been. Anyhow, he sat down, gave me a wonderful interview. The interview was about how he came to be Ronald Reagan, his childhood and the influences on him. And then at the end, the arrangement had been that he would shake hands with the crew and thank me. And Ken Duberstein said, and then he wants to do something. I'm not sure what it is. Anyhow, we finished the interview. He does the thanking the crew, and then he says to me, Tom, why don't we go out on the porch overlooking the Rose Garden? Staff has no. I said, well, very good, Mr. President. I'd like to do that. So we go out there, and a photographer shows up and starts taking pictures of us. And the president, this is highly unusual for him because he was a different person privately than he was publicly. I mean, he was not a very touchy-feely kind of guy. But he put his arm around my shoulder and he said, Tom, Nancy and I were talking about you this morning. You were with us from the very beginning. And I said, yes, Mr. President, I was. It's been a real privilege. Kind of got that Reagan smile, and he said, worked out pretty well for both of us, didn't it? Thank you all very much for being here.
So I think this evening has worked out pretty well for all of us. To sloppily paraphrase President Kennedy when he talked about Jefferson and the impact of his dining alone in the White House, you can talk to 1,000 political experts in your life, and you will not get as much insight and knowledge as we've gotten tonight from Chris Whipple and Tom Brokaw, for which we thank you. Please join us upstairs.